My husband died after my children refused to help fund his cancer treatment. Their cold rejection and absence at his funeral shatter me emotionally, but also awaken a steely resolve. I discover secrets about each child and uses them, step by step, to dismantle their worlds until they're forced to face the consequences of abandoning their father. Before we get into the story, tell us in the comment section where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave your honest review. I still remember that night. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the weak yellow glow of the overhead light. It made the shadows seem deeper, heavier. The clock ticked softly in the background, and in front of me, the table was buried under a mess of papers, hospital invoices, prescription receipts, and an endless stream of medical bills that seemed to multiply every time I blinked. Thomas was in the next room, resting in his recliner. His once broad shoulders seemed smaller now, his skin pale from weeks of chemotherapy. And yet, he still smiled when our eyes met, as if to tell me, "Don't worry, we'll get through this." But we were not getting through this, not without help. I sat there, staring at those numbers, the cost of keeping him alive. My hands trembled, not from fear alone, but from the weight of knowing I might lose him, not because his illness couldn't be treated, but because we couldn't afford the treatment much longer. So I made a decision. I would call the children, our children. They had the means, they had the resources. Surely, they would understand. This was their father. The man who had worked himself to the bone to give them a better life. The first call was to David. It took him 3 rings to answer, his voice clipped and distracted. I could hear the hum of an office in the background, muffled voices, the tapping of keyboards. "Mom, I'm in the middle of something," he said before I'd even finished greeting him. "I know, sweetheart," I replied softly. "But I wouldn't call if it wasn't important. Your father, Thomas, the treatments are working, but we need to continue them. The bills," I hesitated. "I can't cover them alone anymore." There was a pause, and then a sigh, not one of concern, but of irritation. "Mom, I've got deals falling apart here. I can't just pull out thousands for this. You need to figure it out." This, that's how he referred to his father's life, as if it were an inconvenience to his schedule. "I just thought maybe," I began, but he cut me off. "Look, maybe sell the house. That'll solve your problem." And then he hung up. The second call was to Claire. I caught her just as she was getting ready for some charity dinner. I could hear clinking glasses and soft music in the background. "Oh, Mom, you know I care," she said, her tone dripping with artificial sweetness. "But, well, my husband and I talked about it, and honestly, investing in a losing battle isn't wise. I mean, what if you spend all that money and nothing changes?" I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. "This isn't an investment, Claire. This is your father's life." She sighed. "I wish I could do more, I really do. But maybe selling the house is the best option. Downsizing might even be good for you." Good for me. As if tearing apart the home we built over 40 years was some kind of personal upgrade. The last call was to Ethan. I could hear waves and laughter behind him. He was on vacation, again. "Mom, I'd help you if I could," he said lazily, "but I'm kind of broke right now. Maybe there's a charity or, I don't know, a church fund?" "A charity?" I asked. "For your father?" "Yeah, people do that all the time." And just like that, the conversation ended. He had a dinner reservation to get to. By the time I hung up, my hands were ice cold. Not one of them, not one, offered to come home, to see their father, to comfort him. Instead, they all offered the same solution. Sell the house. The home where Thomas and I had raised them. The home we had painted together, fought over wallpaper in, celebrated birthdays and Christmases in. No, I would not sell it. 2 days later, I was in the kitchen again, brewing tea. The phone rang, and without thinking, I picked it up, but the call wasn't for me. It was for Thomas. His phone had been accidentally left on speaker. It was our children, all 3 of them. At first, I thought they were finally checking in. But then, I heard David chuckling. "She's still clinging to him," he said. "It's ridiculous." Claire's voice chimed in. "Honestly, it's her problem. She's acting like this is some tragic love story. He's dying. That's what people do." And Ethan, my youngest, laughed and said, "I give it 2 months. She should just let him go." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I stood there, holding the phone, listening to my own children mock their father's suffering, as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience. I didn't speak. I didn't make a sound. I just listened. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. The grief was still there, sharp and relentless, but beneath it, something else began to grow. Something colder, sharper. I hung up the phone, set down the tea, and walked into the living room. Thomas was asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. I sat beside him, took his frail hand in mine, and made a promise. "They will regret this," I whispered. "I swear to you, they will." A month later, Thomas was gone. The funeral was small. A few friends, some distant relatives, neighbors who remembered him fondly. But not our children. David sent a short email, "Sorry for your loss." Claire sent flowers with a card that simply read, "Thinking of you." Ethan didn't even send that, just a text 2 days later. "Hope you're okay." I stood by Thomas's grave, the wind cold against my cheeks, the earth freshly turned at my feet. My hands were clasped in front of me, but inside my resolve was tightening like a fist. They thought this was over. They thought I would cry, grieve, and eventually forgive. But they were wrong, because some betrayals don't get forgiven. Some debts don't go unpaid, and mine had just come due. What they didn't know was that I had already started planning, and the first to feel it would be David. Grief changes you, but betrayal shapes you into something entirely new. After Thomas's funeral, I spent days in silence, no phone calls, no visitors. I sat in our living room with the curtains half closed, the light spilling in just enough to keep me from feeling like I'd vanished entirely. But my mind was awake, sharper than it had ever been. And I knew exactly where I would start. David. David was always the ambitious one, the one who strutted into every room as if it belonged to him. He liked to tell people he was self-made, that every dollar he had was earned through his own hard work. But I knew the truth. I remembered the years when Thomas worked double shifts, 14, sometimes 16 hours, to put David through business school. I remembered Thomas selling his vintage Mustang, the one he'd spent a decade restoring, just to pay David's tuition when scholarships fell short. And David never once thanked him. Not properly. To him, Thomas's sacrifices were just expected. That was his weakness, not gratitude. No, David's true weakness was pride. Pride in the lie he'd built about himself. And I was going to tear that lie apart. I began in the attic. There's something about the quiet up there that makes you feel like you're trespassing in your own life. Dust coated the cardboard boxes, each one labeled in Thomas's neat handwriting. Taxes, receipts, business. I sifted through them slowly, my fingers tracing the edges of old envelopes. And then I found it, a manila folder, thick with papers, marked simply, David, Loans. I sat cross-legged on the floor as I read. The records went back nearly 20 years. Bank statements, repayment plans, and 3 separate occasions where Thomas had secretly paid off David's failed business debts. Thousands of dollars. David had never repaid a cent. I closed the folder, my heartbeat steady. This was my leverage. But I needed more. The next day, I called one of Thomas's old friends, Peter Walsh. Peter had worked in finance for decades and knew the sort of whispers that never reached the public. He was surprised to hear from me, but when I told him I was looking into David's business dealings, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial hush. "Your son's playing with fire, Margaret," he said. "He's been inflating his company's profits for at least a year to keep investors happy. If that gets out..." He didn't finish the sentence, he didn't have to. I thanked him and hung up, my fingers already itching to put the next part of my plan into motion. I knew exactly who to send it to, a journalist named Kara Blake. She wasn't just any reporter, she was David's favorite. I remembered overhearing him praise her once at a dinner party, saying she was one of the few real journalists left. How poetic. That night, under the dim light of my desk lamp, I scanned every incriminating document, the old loan records, the payment receipts in Thomas's name, and a few other details Peter had hinted at, enough to make any editor salivate. I wrote an anonymous email, framing it as an inside tip from someone who had worked closely with David. I was careful with my words, careful to make it sound like the confession of a former associate who had grown tired of David's corruption and lies. Before hitting send, I attached every last document. Then, I sent another package, a physical one, to David's biggest competitor, Mason & Cole Enterprises. No note, just the folder and a sticky note that read, "For your review." 3 days later, it happened. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. Dozens of notifications, news alerts, messages from neighbors, even a voicemail from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. When I turned on the television, there it was. David Reynolds exposed, business fraud allegations shake the market. The reporter's voice was calm, almost sympathetic, as she detailed how David's company had been caught inflating profits, misleading investors, and hiding years of unpaid debts secretly covered by his own father. The story went viral. By noon, David's company's stock had dropped 62%. By evening, his investors had filed lawsuits. His assets were frozen, his offices raided. The photo they used on the news was almost comical. David mid-speech, his mouth open, his eyes caught in a strange, bewildered glare, like a man who had just realized the stage beneath him was collapsing. I made myself tea and sat by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. The television murmured in the background, reporters dissecting every detail of David's fall from grace. And I felt nothing but quiet satisfaction. For years, he had lived off the image of a man who had pulled himself up by his own brilliance. But now, the world saw him for what he truly was. A fraud propped up by the very father he had abandoned. As the rain turned to a steady downpour, my phone rang. It was David. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. "Mom, I don't know what happened, but I'm ruined. They're saying things that I need your help." I didn't call back. But even as I sipped my tea, watching David's empire crumble, I knew this was only the beginning. Because there were still 2 more children. And the next one was Claire. And unlike David, Claire didn't just care about money. She cared about status. Destroying her wouldn't just mean taking something away, it would mean turning her entire world upside down. And I was already thinking about how to do it. If David thought his fall was spectacular, Claire was about to discover what it really felt like to lose everything, in public. Some people are fueled by ambition, others by greed. But Claire was powered by image. Everything in her life was curated, from the fresh flowers in her foyer to the way she tilted her head in photographs. She was the refined sibling, the one who knew the right fork to use, the one who made a show of attending charity galas and sipping champagne with the city's so-called elite. But behind that polished exterior was someone cold, calculated, someone who could look her dying father in the eye, or worse, not look at him at all, and still go to lunch as if nothing had happened. I remembered the day Thomas sold that small plot of land we had kept for years, just so Claire could have her dream wedding. Her fiancé's family had refused to contribute, claiming it was tradition for the bride's family to cover expenses. Thomas didn't hesitate. He wanted her to have her moment, and when he walked her down the aisle, you could see the pride in his eyes. Pride she never truly earned. That memory was still fresh when I decided it was her turn. It started with an invitation I was never supposed to receive. Claire was hosting one of her lavish spring benevolence luncheons, a fundraiser for a local arts foundation. I didn't get an invite, of course, but I knew enough people in her circle to make it happen. A quick phone call to one of her less observant committee members, and suddenly my name was on the guest list. I arrived early, dressed in a simple but elegant navy dress, the kind that whispered dignity without screaming for attention. I knew Claire wouldn't be able to refuse me entry without causing a scene. The venue was exquisite, floor-to-ceiling windows draped with white chiffon, crystal glasses catching the afternoon sun, and tables decorated with arrangements so tall they made it difficult to see the person across from you. Claire was in her element, wearing a pale pink dress and a smile that could have been painted on. When she saw me, there was the slightest flicker of discomfort in her eyes before she quickly masked it. "Oh, Mother, what a surprise," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek. I smiled back. I thought it was time we reconnected. The trick with people like Claire is that you never attack them head-on. No, you plant seeds. Let them grow roots in the minds of the people they're trying to impress. Over canapés, I joined a small group of her friends. I laughed politely at their stories, waited for the right moment, and then, in the most casual tone imaginable, I said, "You know, it's been such a difficult year. When Thomas was sick, I hoped Claire might have been able to visit more. But of course, she was so busy with events like these." I didn't accuse her. I didn't even sound bitter. I simply let the words hang there. One woman frowned slightly. Another sipped her champagne without meeting my eyes. I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads. At another table, I told a similar story, how Claire had once postponed a hospital visit because it clashed with a designer trunk show. I made sure to end with, "But of course, she has such important commitments, I understand." By the time dessert was served, the whispers had started. I didn't need to hear them to know they were there. But I wasn't finished. While I was planting doubts in her social garden, I had already set another plan in motion. I had hired a discreet investigator, an old acquaintance of Thomas's who owed me a favor. His task? Look into Claire's husband, Andrew. It didn't take long. A few weeks later, he came to me with a file so damning it almost felt too easy. Andrew had been quietly embezzling funds from the very charity Claire chaired. Small amounts at first, then bolder sums, siphoned through shell accounts and fake invoices. It was perfect. The first envelope went to the charity's board of directors, sent anonymously. The second went to a well-connected gossip columnist who thrived on scandal in high society. I didn't have to spell out the story for her. She could smell blood the moment she saw the numbers. And then, I waited. The fallout was swift. 2 weeks later, I sat in my kitchen, sipping tea, when the news broke. The Arts Foundation had regretfully accepted the resignation of Mrs. Clare Reynolds, amid serious concerns over financial mismanagement. The article didn't explicitly accuse her, but the implication was enough. The gossip column was far less subtle. Charity queen or queen of deceit, Clare Reynolds steps down in shame. Her friends, the ones who used to gush over her dresses and dinner parties, suddenly had other plans. The invitations stopped coming, the phone calls went unanswered. I didn't see her until she came to my door. It was raining, and she was drenched, her perfect hair sticking to her face. "Mother," she said, her voice trembling, "I need your help. Everything is falling apart. They're saying things about me, about Andrew, things that aren't true." I looked at her for a long moment. She was shaking, but not from guilt, from fear. Not fear of what she had done, but fear of what she had lost. "You have to fix this," she said, almost pleading. "You know people. You can talk to them." I stepped aside just enough for her to see into the hallway. On the wall hung a framed photo of Thomas, taken just months before he fell ill. "Do you remember," I said slowly, "when I called you, asking you to come see him? And you told me it wasn't convenient?" She looked away. "I'm afraid," I said softly, "that you'll have to figure it out yourself, just like you told me." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She turned and walked back into the rain. I closed the door and leaned against it, listening to the sound of the storm. Another piece had fallen. Another betrayal answered. But there was still one left. Ethan, my youngest. My charming, careless son who had always managed to talk his way out of trouble. He thought I could never turn on him. He thought his smile was enough to make me forget. But he was wrong. And soon, he would learn that even charm has an expiration date. Ethan was always the charming one. The one who could walk into a room and have everyone laughing within minutes. The one who could flash a boyish smile and convince you that whatever he'd done wrong wasn't really that bad. To Thomas, he was the baby. The son he worried over, defended, forgave, even when he shouldn't have. I'd lost count of the number of times Thomas had bailed Ethan out of debt. Credit cards maxed out. Bad investments. One year, it was even a gambling loss he swore he'd pay back in a week. Thomas covered it, quietly, never breathing a word of it to me until much later. I thought I knew all of Ethan's sins. I didn't. It was 3 months after Thomas's funeral when I found out about the watch collection. Thomas had spent 40 years building it, antique timepieces, each with a story. There was the gold pocket watch he'd found at a flea market in Paris when we were newlyweds. The silver Omega he'd worn every day until the chemo made his wrists too thin. And my personal favorite, a delicate 19th century railroad watch he'd restored himself, polishing the brass until it gleamed like captured sunlight. One evening I went to take the Omega from its case. It wasn't there. In fact, none of them were. At first, I thought maybe I'd misplaced them in my grief. But the truth came in the form of a casual conversation with an old friend of Ethan's, one who didn't realize I didn't already know. "Oh, Ethan made a killing selling those watches last year," he said. Said it funded that luxury trip to Santorini. You must have been furious. The words hit me like a cold slap. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just sat there, listening, while something inside me hardened like cooling steel. Ethan had stolen from his father before he died. Not just money, not just possessions. He had taken the one thing Thomas truly treasured and turned it into a holiday for himself. If David's crime had been arrogance, and Claire's had been vanity, Ethan's was betrayal. And betrayal has a way of erasing even the fondest memories. It was time to finish what I'd started. The plan came together slowly, each piece clicking into place like the gears of one of Thomas's old watches. I knew Ethan was always looking for the next easy score. I also knew he fancied himself a bit of an art broker, thanks to a handful of shady deals he'd been involved in overseas. He didn't know the first thing about art, but he knew how to talk, and sometimes that's all people need to believe you. So I became someone new. A wealthy, discreet collector. The kind who never appeared on social media, but whose name whispered through private circles like a rumor too good to ignore. I created an alias, complete with a fabricated background, a few well-timed mentions in minor art forums, and a portfolio of recent acquisitions I had sourced from stock images and forgery listings. And then, I dangled the bait, a rare 19th century painting I claimed to want, one that had been circulating in the black market. A piece so exclusive and so expensive that Ethan wouldn't be able to resist trying to broker the deal. What he didn't know was that the painting was part of a sting operation coordinated with law enforcement. They'd been watching the stolen art circuit for months, and my offer was the final thread in their net. Ethan bit hard. "Oh, this is perfect timing, Mom," he said when he called me out of the blue, pretending he'd stumbled onto the opportunity himself. "I've got a contact in Europe who can get this for me. Big commission, could change everything for me." I made my voice sound supportive, even eager. "Oh, Ethan, that sounds wonderful. Just be careful. You know how dangerous these things can be." "I've got it handled," he said with a grin I could hear through the phone. "This is the big one." It was, just not for him. A week later, the deal went down. He met the seller in a hotel suite, handed over a deposit, and posed for a photograph with the painting to show the buyer, me. That photograph would later be plastered across the news under headlines like, "Local man caught in international art theft sting. From high life to handcuffs, the fall of Ethan Reynolds." The money trail was traced, his accounts were frozen. The so-called friends who'd partied with him in Greece vanished overnight. 2 weeks later, I saw him again, in court. He looked thinner, paler. The confidence that had once been his armor was cracked. During a recess, he approached me. His voice shook. "Mom, you have to testify. Tell them I didn't know it was stolen. They'll believe you." I reached into my bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he took it. It was Thomas's obituary. "I stood by my husband," I said quietly. "You couldn't even show up." He looked at me, eyes wide, as if seeing me for the first time. But I turned away before he could say another word. Months passed. The scandal faded from the headlines, replaced by fresher news. But for me, the work was done. On a cool autumn morning, I walked to the cemetery. The grass was damp, and the air carried that faint scent of falling leaves. Thomas's grave was just as I'd left it, the headstone clean, the lettering sharp against the granite. I knelt, placing a single white lily at its base. "Well, my love," I murmured, "it's done." Each of them faced their own reckoning, not from the law, but from the truth they tried to bury. I brushed my hand over the stone, tracing his name. "Justice isn't always about the courts," I said softly. "Sometimes it's just about keeping a promise." I stood, feeling the weight lift, not entirely but enough, and as I walked away, I didn't look back. If you've ever been betrayed, you know the scars never truly fade. But sometimes, taking back your power means rewriting the ending to your own story. If Margaret's journey moved you, if you felt her pain and her strength, I invite you to subscribe. Because here, we tell the stories that don't flinch from the darkness, but still find the light. And remember, some promises are worth keeping.